This is World Civilization. My name is Dr. Long. This video is entitled The First World War. In 1914, the Western world led the world in science, technology, industry, and finance. Major European powers had colonial empires that controlled much of the world, especially in Asia and Africa. 1/4 of humanity alone lived inside the British Empire, an empire that spanned the entire world, leading to the saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire. Europeans in 1914 viewed themselves as culturally and even racially superior to other peoples, particularly peoples in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Yet, after the assassination of Austrian Archduke Francis Ferdinand on July 14, 1914, Europe was plunged into a bloody 4-year war, known at the time as the Great War. After the Second World War, the Great War, as it was commonly known in the 1920s and 1930s, became known as the First World War. Now, by 1915, the First World War featured two main sides. First was the Allies. This included France, Russia, Britain, Italy, Romania, Belgium, Serbia, and Japan. The second was the Central Powers, named for their central location in Europe, and this included Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. The First World War, which raged from 1914 until 1918, resulted in around 10 million deaths in combat and 30 million men who were wounded, many of them gravely. Many of them left handicapped, and these were staggering casualties at the time. These were a level that the world had never seen before, over 10 million dead and 30 million wounded. Now, as historian John Morrow argues in his 2004 book, The Great War, An Imperial History, while nationalism was an important force in the First World War, imperialism was ultimately more important and was the driving force behind the war itself. John Morrow argues that Europeans used their economic and technological advantages to dominate much of the world and construct large empires in Africa and Asia. But competition for empire was ultimately what caused them to turn on themselves in 1914. In that sense, the First World War represents the chickens coming home to roost for imperialism. In other words, the cultural arrogance and racism that led Europeans to dominate non-Europeans, in turn led them to fight themselves in 1914. Likewise, the technology that Europeans employed against non-Europeans came to be used against themselves as well. When the First World War broke out in Europe in the summer of 1914, Germany, which had the best quality military on the continent, had a plan to win the war. And this plan was known as the Schlieffen Plan, after the general that came up with it. The Schlieffen Plan involved a large German invasion of Belgium because Belgium provided a very good invasion route to northern France. The ultimate goal of the Schlieffen Plan was for the German army to invade through Belgium, go into northern France, capture Paris very quickly, and knock France out of the war. This in turn would allow the Germans to concentrate on the other major power that they feared, Russia. So, when the war began, Germany attacked through Belgium. But Belgium had a neutrality treaty with Britain, and Britain guaranteed Belgium neutrality. So, when Germany invaded Belgium, Britain declared war on Germany. Now, despite initial problems in invading Belgium, German forces achieved a great deal of success. In fact, they got within 30 miles of Paris. However, the French army rallied, and they beat the Germans back in the September 1914 Battle of the Marne, a battle that saved Paris from German capture. After the Battle of the Marne, from September 1914 until December of 1914, German and French forces in northern France and in Belgium began digging opposing trench lines. And these trench lines would stretch from the Swiss border all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, about 475 miles of trenches. For the rest of the war, northern France and Belgium was known as the Western Front. And while the war was fought in many places across the world, the Western Front was the largest and the bloodiest area of combat, the largest front. The Western Front was primarily characterized by trench warfare. Soldiers lived in opposing trench lines. Now, as it rains a lot in northern France and is very cold, the rain would often turn the ground into mud, and conditions in the trenches were filthy. Lice and rats were not uncommon, and sanitation was very poor for soldiers who had to man these trenches so that the opposing army would not overrun them. Soldiers in trenches, whether they were German or French or British, faced dangers such as artillery bombardments, poison gas, infantry attacks, machine gun attacks, snipers, and all this made their life very dangerous and very deadly. Conditions in the trenches were appalling, and this was hardly the romantic warfare that had often been portrayed in European culture in the 19th century. Trench warfare meant that troops hunkered down in their trenches to try to hold them. The only way to push back the enemy was to try to bombard the opposing trench line, kill as many soldiers as possible, and then charge with your infantry and overrun them. Yet this was rarely successful, and in most attacks, little ground was ever gained. So trench warfare was a war of bloody stalemate. The bloodiest battle of the entire war was the Battle of Verdun, fought in 1916 along the Western Front between the French and German armies. This war was fought throughout much of 1916. No ground was gained, and by the end of the battle, 714,000 German and French soldiers had been killed and wounded. Likewise in 1916, also along the Western Front, the Battle of the Somme, the British launched a massive attack against the Germans to try to relieve Verdun. And after a huge bombardment, they thought they could break through the German forces. But this was to no avail. The Germans had dug in, and when the British went over the top and charged out of their trenches, on the very first day of the British attack on German lines, 58,000 British soldiers were killed and wounded. To this day, this is the bloodiest day of British military history. Think of it, 58,000 men killed and wounded on one day of combat, the first day of combat of the Battle of the Somme. And this still to this day has been very traumatic in British military history. Losses were appalling on the Western Front. To give you a sense of an average of this, from 1914 to 1918, on average, France lost 900 men each day, while Germany lost an average of 1,300 men each day. This is each day. Most of these losses were on the Western Front. Now, while the Western Front was the bloodiest area of fighting, it was hardly the only front of the First World War. This was a global war. From 1915 until 1918, Italy, which was on the Allies' side, waged a bloody trench warfare in the treacherous Alps Mountains against German and Austro-Hungarian forces. Also, there was an Eastern Front, which consisted of Eastern Europe and Russia. Now, because the Eastern Front was so large, consisting of thousands of miles, trench warfare was impractical, and the warfare there was more mobile in nature. Now, the Eastern Front featured the Russian army fighting on the Allies against the Germans and the Austro-Hungarian armies of the Central Powers. Now, the Russian army was very large, but it was very poorly equipped. And this was due to Russia's lack of industrialization. In fact, Russian soldiers were told, that if one of your fellow soldiers is killed in front of you who has a rifle, well, pick up his gun and fight with it. Not all Russian soldiers even sit into battle with rifles. Now, Russian forces, despite these severe limitations of not enough guns to go around, could hold their own against the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in the Brusilov offensive of 1916, they actually pushed the Austro-Hungarian army back and took control of much of the Carpathian Mountains in Central Europe. However, industrial production, and thus the home front, was very key to the armies of the First World War. Again, Russia was not fully industrialized and had a hard time keeping up with production. Germany, on the other hand, was fully industrialized and not only had the best quality military, but their production was quite strong. So when the Russians fought the Germans, they struggled mightily. By 1917, Russia was experiencing severe problems in the First World War. They had lost 2 million men, and the war seemed to drag on for no reason with no end in sight. The ruler of Russia, Tsar Nicholas II, was an absolute monarch, but he seemed increasingly isolated and out of touch with the Russian people who were suffering due to the war and due to a struggling economy. In March 1917, strikes broke out in Russia, and Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, stepping down from the throne. Russia then had a provisional government which continued the war until October 1917, when Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the exile group of Bolsheviks, a radical Marxist group, staged a revolution and overthrew the government. Now, most Russians had no idea about Marxism or the Bolsheviks, but Lenin promised them 3 things they wanted: bread, peace, and land. The Bolshevik Revolution, launched by Vladimir Lenin and his followers in October 1917, plunged Russia into a revolution and civil war. And in the spring of 1918, they left the war, signing a separate peace treaty with Germany. Now, the First World War was also fought in the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire was allied to Germany. The war, however, was an utter disaster for the Ottomans. The British attempted to capture the Ottoman capital of Istanbul in an effort to resupply Russia. British forces, largely under the urging of the Lord Admiral of the Navy, Winston Churchill, landed a large contingent in Gallipoli in the Ottoman Empire in an attempt to break through and capture Istanbul. Now, the British forces at the Gallipoli landing were largely composed of Australian and New Zealanders, which brought them into the war. The Gallipoli landing, though, was a disaster. Very little ground was gained. British forces did not break through and capture Istanbul, and they lost over 150,000 men. The British continued to fight against the Ottomans despite the failure of the Gallipoli landing. They would stir up Arab nationalism against the Ottomans and incite Arabs to revolt against their Ottoman Turkish rulers. The Ottoman Turks, because of the fear of revolts from ethnic and religious minorities, also attempted to persecute those who they suspected of working with the Allies. The Turks feared ethnic and national minorities such as Arabs, Greeks, and Armenians would use the war as a reason to revolt against their government. And unfortunately, the Ottoman government and the army especially cracked down on the Armenians, a Christian people living in Anatolia. The Ottomans engaged in massacres and forced deportation. For instance, rounding up thousands of civilians and killing them or sending them to the desert, and the use of concentration camps against the Armenian civilians. Now, estimates vary widely, but between 500,000 and up to 1.5 million Armenian civilians, men, women, and children, died in what was called the Armenian genocide at the hands of the Ottoman government and an army. And this was the first modern genocide of a specific race or ethnicity. To this day, the Turkish government adamantly denies the Armenian genocide and goes after historians who seek to research it. And later Adolf Hitler would remark that no one remembers the Armenians in reference to what he had in mind for the Jews. The First World War was also fought in the Pacific, with Japan attacking and seizing small German territories. Also, the First World War was fought in Africa, with British colonies taking on German colonies in East Africa. Africans were also recruited to serve in German, British, and French armies. About 1 million Africans served on all sides, 150,000 of whom died in the war. For their part, the French saw Africans from Senegal as more primitive and fiercer warriors, largely because of racist views of Africans. And they used Senegalese troops on the Western Front, all with appalling losses for Africans. Now, Africans saw the war as senseless, and they saw the way they were treated as negative. And this impacted their economies because men were taken from African countries to fight. And it also gave rise to nationalism in some parts of Africa as a backlash against Europeans forcing them to fight in this war. In addition to Africans, the British used Indian soldiers in the war, especially against the Ottomans. The First World War also saw the first aerial combat. The air war was especially important for intelligence on the Western Front, and airplanes during the First World War were the eyes of the army on the ground. Likewise, the seas were an important area of battle. In the 1916 Battle of Jutland off the coast of Denmark between the British and German Navy, these two forces squared off in what was one of the largest naval battles in history. Now, while the Battle of Jutland was largely inconclusive, almost like the trench warfare on the Western Front, the real conflict on the seas was over rival blockades. The British Navy had blockaded Germany and cut off their trade with countries such as the United States. Now, this really squeezed the German economy, even leading to food shortages and winters that the Germans called turnip winters because there was nothing else to eat. The Germans, for their part, retaliated. Just as the British had imposed a naval blockade on trade with Germany, the Germans sought to use what were called U-boats or submarines to impose a blockade on Britain. Now, submarine warfare was very controversial, especially in the United States. The United States had stayed neutral during the war, but the United States sold billions of agricultural goods and industrial goods to the British and the French, despite their neutrality. On May 7, 1915, a German submarine sunk the British ship the Lusitania, killing nearly 1,200 civilians, including 128 Americans. Now, the Lusitania was a passenger ship, but it also carried guns and ammunition bound for Britain in its cargo. Still, the United States was outraged and nearly declared war with Germany, causing the Germans to back down from submarine warfare in 1915. American President Woodrow Wilson actually won re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But Germany would resume unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917 in a bid to strangle British trade and knock Britain out of the war. This resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, together with what was called the Zimmermann Telegraph, an attempt by German Ambassador Arthur Zimmermann to stir up Mexico to attack the United States, and the telegram that was intercepted by British intelligence and given to the Americans. All of these factors, but particularly the submarine warfare, caused the United States to switch its position and to declare war on Germany on April 6, 1917. Thus, the United States would join the Allies. Now, it took months for the Americans to train up a large army and send it across the Atlantic to help the British and French on the Western Front. And in the spring of 1918, with Russia leaving the war and a large American force about to arrive in Europe, the Germans realized they had a brief window of opportunity to win the war. So they pulled most all of their men from the Eastern Front, concentrated them on the Western Front. In the spring of 1918, the Germans launched a massive offensive along the Western Front. Now, this offensive was fairly successful. It got within 35 miles of Paris and even bombarded Paris. But ultimately, it failed. In the summer of 1918, American troops and a new technology, tanks, drove back the Germans. German high command realized they could not win the war. The ruler of Germany, the absolute monarch, Kaiser William II, advocated the throne. And on November 11, 1918, the Germans requested an armistice with the Allies, resulting in an end of the fighting and effectively an Allied victory in the war. Now, the actual end to the war, the formal end of the war at least, came in 1919 with a series of treaties signed in Paris. American President Woodrow Wilson had called the First World War a war to end all wars and a war to make the world safe for democracy. Wilson had proposed during the war itself a series of proposals he called the 14 points. And these were proposals that he wanted the world to accept that would lead to a fair peace, fair borders, free trade, and what he called the self-determination of nations. In other words, the right of every national and ethnic people to have their own independent nation state. Wilson thought the 14 points would remedy all the problems that led to the First World War in the first place. But while Wilson wanted a fair peace, including a fair peace for Germany, the British and French were not interested in a fair peace. Now, they did agree with Wilson's most important goal, the establishment of an international body to keep the peace known as the League of Nations. The British and French would enter that and would join it. Ironically, the United States never joined the League of Nations, as the U.S. Senate failed to ratify the treaty. Moreover, in 1919, the Versailles Treaty, the treaty that dealt with Germany, in this treaty, Germany was blamed for the war, was forced to pay heavy reparations, lost its colonies, lost some of its land to new countries such as Poland, and saw its military reduced to a small force, including a ban on submarines and airplanes and other modern equipment. As mentioned, the British and French were not interested in a fair peace with Germany. Rather, they feared fighting another disastrous war with Germany and sought to use the Versailles Treaty to keep Germany down. Now, this led to a great deal of resentment in Germany, being blamed for the war and punished so heavily for the war, and would destabilize from the very beginning Germany's new democracy, the Weimar Republic. Also, at the end of the war, Russia was in the middle of a civil war and revolution, with threats of communist revolutions in other nations as well. Likewise, the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they collapsed and fell apart into separate nations at the end of the war. And in 1918 and 1919, a massive flu epidemic known as the Spanish influenza swept the world, killing tens of millions of people, more than the war itself. So let's draw a few conclusions. The First World War was an enormously bloody war, like nothing the world had seen up to 1914. Only the Second World War would surpass it in terms of loss of life. Because Europeans dominated much of the world through their colonial empires, the war, which began in Europe, spread to much of the rest of the world as well. As historian John Morrow has argued, European imperialism lay behind much of the war, with the technology and brutality that Europeans used to dominate non-Europeans coming home to Europe itself in 1914. The First World War exposed European claims of racial and civilizational supremacy as hollow. After all, if Europe was so superior, so great, so much better than other civilizations, how could it have caused such a horrible war? Many Europeans in the 1920s began to doubt the superiority of the West because of the First World War. Likewise, many non-Europeans living in European empires took notice of how the war weakened Europe. They also began to doubt the superiority of Europe and to begin to further seek independence from European control. Figures such as Mahatma Gandhi in India and Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, who interestingly enough attempted to meet with Woodrow Wilson at Paris but was rebuffed. These sorts of figures would come to lead nationalist independence movements in their respective nations. So the First World War thus sowed the seeds of the end of European empires. The First World War was also, in a sense, a senseless war that did not lead to did not result in a lasting peace. It was not a war to end all wars, as American President Woodrow Wilson put it, but rather, as a British officer observed, the peace that followed was very unstable and was a peace to end all peace. The First World War destabilized Europe. It set the stage for all the horrors of the 20th century, including communism, Italian fascism, Nazism in Germany, the Second World War, and the Holocaust. And I'll stop here. Thanks for watching.